Sol, June 2160. The nation-states of Earth had become divided between two political alliances that had emerged sometime in the 21st century. On the one side was the Western Alliance, which consisted of the United States, the United Kingdom, Italy, France, Germany, Japan, and Spain. Opposite from the alliance was the Eastern Coalition, a united entity that was made up of three governments, starting with the Eastern Republic, which itself consisted of the old Soviet Union and its republics, followed by the Tigris Confederation, which was made up of the Middle Eastern nations, and lastly the East Asian Federation. For decades since the lunar conflict of 2075, political disagreements, skirmishes, and raids between the two powers across the solar system had slowly grown to the point where neither side could tolerate such conflicts any longer. It was agreed by both sides that peace was the only way forward. Negotiations between the two factions would continue until it would finally culminate in the Balma Treaty. All it needed by mid-2160 was for both the Alliance and the Coalition to meet and sign the agreement, thus making it official. It was decided that they would meet on Europa at the Alliance colony of Base Kennedy, where a new era of peace and cooperation would hopefully begin. But the signing never happened. The Eastern Coalition had no plans to make peace with the Western Alliance. To them, the future did not lie in cooperation, but dominance, and they would make sure it was the Coalition that would be the supreme power in Sol. And none believed this more than Admiral Vladimir Kulov, one of the senior-most leaders of the Coalition Political Council. Perhaps realizing that surprise would be critical in his opening gambit to destroy the Alliance, Kulov moved Coalition forces into secret staging points across Sol, while the Alliance was lulled into a false sense of security at the prospect of peace. When they began to stand down their military in preparation for the signing of the Balma Treaty, that was when Kulov chose to strike. Unbeknownst to the Alliance, as Admiral Kulov and his carrier entered Europa's orbit, an entire Coalition starfighter fleet was cloaked alongside his flagship. As Alliance fighters approached to escort his vessel to its designated position, Kulov signaled the attack. Only a few seconds later, the Coalition fighters uncloaked and launched a savage attack on Base Kennedy and its Alliance defenders. Caught completely off guard, the Alliance was quickly overwhelmed, and shortly after that, Base Kennedy was in ruins. Those Alliance forces that were not decimated in the initial attack were in full retreat. Elsewhere, Eastern Coalition forces were victorious over the Alliance, resulting in the destruction of the French and Italian fleets. When Admiral Kulov, as he was overseeing the destruction, received a request from one of his subordinates for additional ships to house the Alliance prisoners, Kulov coldly replied, "Execute them all. We have no time for prisoners." Any notion of peace had been utterly shattered. An optimist could say that the hostilities between the Alliance and the Coalition was now within sight. But instead of a mutual agreement hammered out between the two powers, it would come about with the seemingly inevitable and complete destruction of the Western Alliance. However, the Alliance was not out of the fight yet. Their forces and holdings had been cut to the bone, but surrender was not an option. Several accounts from fleeing refugees and Alliance ships told horrific tales of civilian convoys being gunned down maliciously by Coalition forces, whereas Alliance Navy ships that broadcast their unconditional surrender fared no better, and their crew's final words were far too often cries for mercy to an uncaring enemy. Any notion that there were rules in war was now a pleasant fantasy of a more civilized past. War, despite the insurmountable odds, was the only way to survive now. Alliance High Command had ordered all ships, civilian and military, to rally at Neptune's moon of Triton, where the surviving Alliance leadership had set up their base of operations. The priority now was to regroup and consolidate if there was to be any chance in fighting the war to come, which was a task made incredibly difficult as the Coalition had never relented in their attacks since the destruction of Base Kennedy. But despite this, the Alliance Navy still needed to protect their fleeing peoples as they made the treacherous journey from inner to outer Sol. In order to do this, a concentrated effort was required by the Alliance to safely bring their people to their new home, which led to the creation of what Alliance leadership eventually dubbed Operation Shield. They had the ships to carry out this endeavor. However, the Alliance needed just one more element: a new generation of starfighter pilots who would take up arms against those who would destroy everything they held dear. A call for enlistment was sent out. Convicts, former veterans, reserves, and civilians with even a modicum of flight experience were called up to join the fight. As a result, many new squadrons were formed in the Western Alliance's darkest hour, like the 604th Buccaneers, and one of the main squadrons that would prove to be critical during Operation SHIELD, the 45th Volunteers. During the first few months of the war, spanning from June to September of 2160, the Alliance focused exclusively on bringing their people to Triton. In the time since the fall of Base Kennedy, the Coalition had consolidated their positions within the inner solar system, driving out or destroying all traces of the Alliance, resulting in a full-on exodus from the inner worlds to Neptune. Refugees were everywhere, and the Alliance Navy and Space Forces were scattered during these trying times. Many of those fleeing failed to reach safety, as they were destroyed or captured as the Coalition was seemingly intent on driving the knife deeper into the Alliance. Those who did manage to escape to Triton told horrifying stories of forced labor camps where starvation ran rampant among their populace. But even these paled in comparison to what happened on Mars, when the Alliance presence there surrendered, resulting in a massacre. And the man behind it was again none other than Admiral Kulov. But still, the survivors trickled in. During these early days of Operation SHIELD, there were many stories of courage under fire. But one of the most notable was the tattered remnants of the British fleet being able to find sanctuary around Neptune, thanks to the newly formed 45th Volunteers on their very first mission. By June 24th, when this mission took place, the British had seemingly outwitted the Coalition hunter groups searching for them. But as the 45th rendezvoused with the survivors, a Black Guard fighter had decided to choose this moment to uncloak and attack the British. This was particularly dangerous as the Black Guard were an elite unit, and any attack led by them was certain to end poorly for the Alliance survivors. But the luck of the British had not expired just yet, as the 45th were able to combat and defeat the Black Guard fighter, along with the subsequent hunter group that was trailing behind it, thus paving a clear path forward for the wayward British to Neptune's space. Fortunately, the success with the British fleet remnants was repeated elsewhere, and many Alliance citizens and service members were able to safely make it to Neptune in their new home. Another shining example of Operation SHIELD at this time was with the 307th Vampires, where its squadron leaders single-handedly saved a civilian transport from an entire Coalition hunting pack. But not all battles were successful, and some had a steep cost in blood. Elsewhere, another squadron, the Hornets, were wiped out entirely as they labored to protect a refugee convoy from that most insidious Coalition squadron, the Black Guard. However, there were also other victories elsewhere, as the Ronin, a squadron from the ANS Yamato, were able to destroy the CS Pachenka, a Coalition cruiser that acted as command ship for the hunting packs that were preying on Alliance ships fleeing to Triton. Presumably with its destruction, Alliance survivors everywhere could more easily make the exodus to safety, without the danger of lurking Coalition fighters. As the war continued on by July 2160, a very perplexing problem had arisen. Coalition fighters were seemingly able to bypass Alliance defensive lines and attack in supposedly secure sectors, much as the Alliance command ship Mantis found out the hard way when it was attacked and destroyed while they were broadcasting their distress call. The 45th Volunteers from the ANS Reliant and the 307th Vampires from the ANS Bremen were tasked to a joint operation to recover the Mantis's black box, so as to shed light on how the Coalition could strike at the Alliance so easily. While the 45th were still very much considered unseasoned rookies at this point in the war, the Vampires were their complete opposite. A veteran and practically legendary squadron with a penchant for victory, under the command of confirmed ace Klaus Steiner, who was leading this operation. Soon after joining together, the two squadrons arrived at the wreckage of the Mantis, and began their search for the ill-fated command ship's black box. Despite some nasty proximity mines hidden in the wreckage left by the Coalition fighters, the black box was found and its contents downloaded, so that the intelligence specialists could pore over the data and investigate the Mantis's fate. But before anyone could say, "Let's head home," a mysterious warp portal opened up in front of the Alliance pilots with the Coalition science vessel and escort fighters emerging from it. Trapped in the warp portal's pull, the 45th and the 307th were forcibly brought into its being, and emerged shortly after near Venus. In the course of a few seconds, the Alliance fighters had traveled across the breadth of the solar system, Quickly analyzing the situation, Klaus Steiner realized that the Coalition were experimenting with warp technology, judging by the prototype warp gate structure that brought them to Venus at the same time it sent out the Coalition science vessel. But any further analysis would have to wait, as the 45th and the Vampires were facing a Coalition carrier launching fighter wings to prevent their escape. Working quickly, Klaus determined that the gate structure had an external reactor that was vulnerable. Desperate to not be trapped behind enemy lines for too long, the Alliance fighters swiftly concentrated their fire on the reactor and escaped back through the still open warp portal as the gate structure exploded. Safely emerging back at the Mantis' wreckage in Outer Sol, only one loose end remained: the Coalition science ship. An anticlimax for the recent adventure the Vampires and the 45th had just undergone, but their duty could not be ignored, as High Command ordered that the science ship be captured. And after a short but successful battle, the science ship was crippled and its fighters joining the debris of what was once the Mantis. With all this new information brought to bear, and the data from the Mantis' black box, it was determined there never was a carrier behind Allied lines. Instead, the Coalition had parked one of their own carriers at the warp gate and simply launched fighters through it to assault Alliance positions and assets. But with the destruction of their warp gate, this decisive Coalition advantage was put to an end for the time being. By early August 2160, the number of refugee convoys and fleeing Alliance Navy ships were beginning to slow down, which was not surprising as Coalition forces at the front lines around Uranus' space were hammering the Alliance hard. Fort Arthur had fallen, and Fort Rushmore was under a state of perpetual siege. Neptune, on the other hand, was coming to be well fortified, and a recent redeployment of the satellite detection and early warning systems had plugged any gaps in their defenses. Even if Uranus were to fall, the Alliance stronghold of Neptune would remain a shining beacon to all free peoples. But as the backlines were finally secure and more Alliance refugees began to find solace in Outer Sol, yet another, but perhaps expected problem arose: a supply shortage. Ever since the start of the war, resource conservation was an ongoing problem, most likely due to the sealing off of the inner system by the Coalition. By late August 2160, the situation had become intolerable, and drastic action needed to be taken. Many Alliance transport ships were still caught behind Coalition lines, presumably waiting for the Alliance Navy to clear a secure route forward back to Neptune. But in the face of flat-out starvation and materiel shortages, the order from Alliance Command was given to a group of mammoth transports to make a break for Neptune as soon as possible, and hopefully the Alliance could cover them en route. But Coalition hunter groups would have loved nothing more than to assault helpless prey weighed down with supplies destined for Triton. The Alliance were not fools. Well, not since Base Kennedy. But territory that deep behind enemy lines could only be reached by fighter craft in a series of long-range jumps. No capital ship or carrier support could be provided lest they be an obviously vulnerable target to the Coalition. All of these factors combined made this a high-stakes gamble to say the least. For such a critical operation, 2 squadrons were selected: the 45th Volunteers and the veteran 705th Cobras led by Colonel John McGann. Together, they would make the long journey to the inner system to protect the convoy. Along the way, they took part in an attack that destroyed the Coalition carrier Badanov, and later on at yet another stop, assisted in harassing a Coalition supply convoy. Despite these delays, the 2 squadrons were able to make it to the Alliance transports, where the pilots found that they were already under attack by Coalition starfighters. Scrambling, the Cobras and the 45th were able to destroy the Coalition marauders, but unfortunately not before one of the 4 mammoth transports had succumbed to the damage inflicted upon it. From there, the still green but increasingly skilled 45th Volunteers were more than able to keep up with the elite 705th Cobras as more Coalition forces attempted to assault the convoy, eventually beating back their attacks entirely and giving some much-needed breathing space for the mammoth transport pilots. With the coast clear of enemy fighters, the 705th was given custody of the convoy, and thus the 45th Volunteers were relieved and cleared to head back to their carrier, the ANS Reliant. With the securing of the mammoth transport convoy, it seemed the Alliance's supply woes would be alleviated, if not solved for the time being. But Colonel McGann decided of his own accord to change the mission. Not long after the 45th returned to the ANS Reliant, did their commanding officer report that while custody of the mammoth transport convoy was given to McGann and his Cobras, Both the transports and the squadrons simply disappeared. McGann had gone rogue and had seemingly decided that he could use the supplies aboard the transports to start a new business venture in piracy. Fortunately, in the days following McGann's betrayal, other waiting transport ships from across Sol were called in, and they were able to successfully reach Neptune and alleviate the Alliance's supply issues. However, piracy was now visibly on the rise, and McGann's Cobras were hitting Alliance convoys hard. They would have to be dealt with in time, but now that the Alliance was fully situated in Outer Sol, they needed to focus on taking the fight to the Coalition, and teach them that the Alliance was not out of the fight yet. Fortunately, an opportunity had presented itself at just the right moment. The CS Ramesses, a Russian carrier, was isolated but en route to a larger Coalition battle group. In addition, she was believed to be low on fighter support. With these factors combined, the destruction of the Ramesses was a perfect target to get the Alliance's point across. And perhaps due to their recent string of victories, the ANS Reliant and the 45th Volunteers were assigned to take the lead on this operation. Once the squadron was in the air, the Ramesses' location was found and confirmed by Fort Baxter, a nearby Alliance space station. As it was under attack by the Russian carrier, it seemed her captain had decided upon a course change before joining the Coalition battle group. The stakes had just been raised considerably. What was supposed to be an easy assault on a lone carrier had become a surprise attack on a vital Alliance installation. The Reliant and the 45th immediately jumped to Fort Baxter, but by the time they arrived they were too late, as upon their entrance the Ramesses unleashed a full torpedo bombardment on Fort Baxter, annihilating the station as its crew ejected in lifeboats. And in a dismissive fashion indicative of utter contempt, it did not wait to gloat over its victory against the Alliance forces or engage them. The Ramesses simply dropped off a fighter wing to dispatch the lifeboats along with the 45th Volunteers before leaving to resume its journey to the Coalition battle group. But Captain Foster aboard the Reliant would not let this grievance be forgotten, and ordered a pursuit course with his ship while the 45th worked to protect their fleeing comrades in the lifeboats, and deal with the fighter wing left behind to finish the Ramesses' job. Reports are unclear whether or not the lifeboats were saved, but the battle among the ruins of Fort Baxter did end quickly, and just in time, as Captain Foster had ordered the 45th back to the Reliant to help defeat the Ramesses. They were taking some heavy hits from the Russian carrier, and they would need the 45th if there was to be any hope of winning the day. Arriving on the scene, the 45th found the two carriers locked in a titanic life-or-death struggle amongst the stars. The battle was precariously balanced between the Reliant and the Ramesses. Anything could tip the odds in either ship's favor, which the 45th fully intended to do for the Reliant. Sweeping through the paltry remains of the Ramesses' fighter wings, the 45th struck the Russian carrier's shield generator, allowing for the Reliant to launch her Gamma-wing bombers and assault the Ramesses directly with their ship-killing torpedoes. And between the Reliant's guns, the 45th's dogged perseverance, and Gamma's explosive ordnance, the Ramesses died an explosive death. The only evidence of their existence afterward would be the new debris field it created, and the mark of a carrier kill in the Reliant's hull. But the Ramesses was just one ship in an Eastern Coalition fleet filled with them. The Western Alliance had won this day, yes, but their wounds were still grievous, which were compounded with the fall of Forts Arthur and Baxter and the annexation of Fort Rushmore. But still, given how this war began, the results could have been far, far worse. The Alliance was still in fighting shape, and with the reconsolidation of their fleet and people, it was high time to begin taking back what the Coalition so wrongfully stole. The stage was now set for the comeback of the century.